Before we kick off the show, if you're a fan of History Hack, please do what you can to support the show. We completely get that not everyone is able or willing to dig into their pockets. Times are hard, but by dropping a like, subscribing on Twitter and YouTube, and importantly, leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts, you can help the programme grow and reach more people. If you're interested in becoming a supporter, go to patreon.com/historyhack, where you'll find perks from secret Facebook groups to early release material. If you just want to leave us a one-off tip, go to ko-fi.com/historyhack. The links are in the description. And whatever form your kind support takes, know that we are massively grateful. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm excited today, Zach, because we're doing something. I don't think we've covered this once really yet on History Hack in 2 years.
No, I don't think so. I had to do a lot of Googling to try and work out what the heck we were going to kind of discuss when it came to putting the questions together for this one, because believe it or not, we do actually do some prep for this.
I know it sounds like we're just making it up as we go along, but we're not.
We're not. And we have a great guest to help us through this, because we're going to look at Iron Age Britain, and we are joined by Lindsey Buster. She's a lecturer in prehistory at Canterbury Christ Church University and is a postgraduate research associate in archaeology at the University of York, with a particular interest in the Iron Age, including funerary practices and cave archaeology. Now, if you're not hooked already, I don't know what's wrong with you. And frankly, I don't know why we took so long to invite a guest on to look at such an interesting topic. But Lindsey, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Shall we set the scene before we dive into the archaeology of all of this? Because I'd imagine a lot of people perhaps aren't that au fait with the Iron Age. So what are we referring to when we talk about it? Are there sort of different phases within the Iron Age? And sort of, I was gathering from what I was reading that you have it kind of arriving in different areas of the world at different times as the sort of some of the technology shifts and transports across the different continents. And what kind of a world are we looking at in terms of things like climate and the development of that technology?
Yeah, well, so the Iron Age, it was developed as part of this three-age system in Scandinavia, in a way to order the cataloguing of artifacts in museums. And so the period is really defined by this new iron technology that comes along. It doesn't replace bronze, but it certainly is added to the repertoire. And it develops in the Near East and moves across Europe. And so, yes, the Iron Age starts in slightly different places across Europe, depending on when this Iron Age or this iron technology reaches particular regions and particular areas. In terms of Britain, we're always quite late to the party in all of these technologies being so far away from kind of the development or the source area for them. And so in Britain, we're talking about really the last truly prehistoric period. So that's the last period where we can't rely on written sources, which is why the material record and archaeology is so important. And so in Britain, we're looking at a period from around about 800 BC, all the way up to when the Romans arrive in AD 43. Well, that is the case in southern Britain, at least. One of the tricky things in Britain is that the Romans have different influence the further north you move in the country. And so the Iron Age, for example, in southern Scotland or even Atlantic Scotland, so the far northwest of Britain, actually extends much later. And in fact, in that Atlantic region, all the way up to the Norse period of AD 800. But for our purposes, for kind of southern Britain and most of the evidence we'll be talking about, it's 800 BC to AD 43, which is the Claudian invasion of Britain.
What does Britain look like?
It's got quite a similar landscape to what we have today. So we're looking at a landscape of field systems and settlement enclosures. The settlement record is also dominated by hill forts, which are basically kind of fortified enclosures defined by banks and ditches, sometimes on hills. They're not always on hills, so it's a bit of a misnomer. And we don't always know that they're forts in that kind of defensive aspect. So hill fort's a little bit of a catch-all category, but they'd have been, practicing kind of mixed farming, wheat, barley, oats, rye, and then domestic animals such as cattle, sheep, and pigs. It would have been quite an open landscape as we see today. A lot of deforestation took place from the Neolithic up to the Bronze Age. So we're not looking at a heavily forested landscape. A lot of the wild species such as bear and lynx and aurochs, which are a kind of native, very, very large wild cattle species, they've become extinct by this point. So we're looking at a landscape which might be quite familiar to us. But hopefully, as I demonstrate through this podcast, actually the Iron Age has many things about it which are particularly unusual and unfamiliar, and I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. In terms of climate, pretty much as it is today, actually. The Bronze Age, so the preceding period, was a little bit sunnier, a little bit warmer, but things begin to go pear-shaped at the end of the Bronze Age in terms of climate, and it gets colder and wetter. So very much actually, the climate that we have today.
Can I ask about the discovery of iron? Do we have any sense of why somebody decided to work this particular type of metal in this particular way? I know that nobody can ever kind of go, okay, the person who discovered it was, for something that happened so far back. But do we have any sense of people kind of tinkering around with different types of rocks to try and extract metal ores from them, and how, iron became the thing that sort of fell out of that process?
Yeah, well, a lot of these technologies, particularly metalworking technologies, develop almost by accident. They're a very, very gradual process. And I think they probably develop out of ad hoc experimentation. In order to understand ironworking, we probably need to go back a step and look at bronze working, which happens in the preceding period. Again, this is a technology that develops in the Near East and Turkey. And actually, when the first copper ores, where we get bronze from, are being exploited in the Near East. It's actually Britain's Neolithic period, so we're still using stone tools and stone technology. So it takes a long time to get to us. But it's probably that, at least in terms of bronze working, copper ores, which sometimes have this beautiful green color because of the oxidization of the copper, were being used actually for pigments, or being turned into jewelry or ornamentation for their their lovely color. And also the discovery of what we call native copper, which is copper that's not bound to an ore. It occurs in the earth's crust in its kind of final raw copper form. So people are probably exploiting those kinds of technologies first, and then from there they're developing more and more sophisticated technologies, which eventually develops into the alloying of copper with particularly tin to make bronze, which is much stronger and much more durable, much better for making things like agricultural tools or axes, for example, than pure copper, which is very, very soft and is not very practical, and not as good as actually the previous stone technologies. It seems that when these technologies are adopted, first of all, they're adopted as kind of prestige objects. And so these new shiny materials come in, and they're used for things like axes, but axes that probably wouldn't have functioned very well, but were more about showing off your latest bling. But as I say, when we get alloying with particularly tin and the development of bronze, then that technology really explodes into a whole range of tools and weaponry, lots of things associated with agriculture. And that's actually really central to the story of Britain, actually, in the Bronze Age, because they have copper mines at the Great Orme, for example, in North Wales, and there's some at Ross Island in the Republic of Ireland, but also tin. Tin is a very, very rare resource, and one of the sources of tin is Cornwall. And so Cornwall actually becomes kind of the centre of the Bronze Age universe at this time. And it's really from those technologies that ironworking then develops. Again, it's brought to Britain probably fully formed. It's not something that is developed or discovered in Britain, and it follows the same kinds of process as bronze work. The very earliest ironworking is sort of experimental, very low quality iron is produced. Iron has a higher melting temperature than copper, and so the ways that we see metals being exploited in prehistory is that those with the lowest melting temperatures, such as gold and silver, then copper, are exploited first, and then the ones that are slightly more difficult to extract from their ores, like iron, are exploited last. And so, yes, in the early Iron Age, we get, kind of experimental metalworking, ironworking in Britain, producing a very small range of artifacts alongside bronze working, not very good quality. And then that improves through the Iron Age. I should mention at this point that the ironworking process in Britain at this time is creating blooms of iron, and that's where the iron doesn't fully melt, and it needs to be reheated and processed many times over to refine it. We don't get cast iron technologies where you can actually pour molten iron into casts until about 1500 AD. And so this is a very different kind of ironworking that we're looking at in prehistory.
I think this is a complete bugger of a question coming at you right now, but how did people live in Iron Age? What do we know about society and functions at this point? So is it based around a tribe, or is it a different social structure? How would life look to us from the outside?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. This is kind of one of the central questions that archaeologists grapple with. We talk a lot about material culture, but actually what we're trying to study through all of that is the structure of society and how people are relating to each other and their landscape. Again, this probably develops through the Iron Age. We have some sense of the beginnings of social stratification in the Bronze Age. Certain people are obviously controlling the extraction and the production of these metal ores and these metal artifacts, and engaging in very long and large trade networks across Europe. And we do see in burials, for example, in the Bronze Age, certain high status individuals coming to prominence. So there is definitely an element of social stratification. Whether we can talk about tribes in the Iron Age is still something that is hotly debated. Certainly, possibly towards the later end of the Iron Age, when societies are interacting with the Roman world, this is again another way in which people can gain prominence and status. When talking about Iron Age Gaul, which is modern day France, Caesar certainly mentions lots and lots of different tribes and various subunits of tribes and various confederations, so larger units of tribes. And we get hints of that, possibly relating to Britain, but not to the same extent. And certainly when Caesar has his first interactions with Britain, he's unsuccessful in conquering Britain, but he does meet with several people that he calls kings. Now, whether that's kings in kind of Caesar's language or something that people in Rome would recognize as kings, we're not sure. And it might also be that at this time, society is operating on a slightly flatter level, something that we would call a heterarchy, perhaps. And that's where different people come to prominence depending on the roles needed at the time. So maybe a certain person is chosen as a war leader at a particular time of conflict, or someone else comes to prominence as a politician when diplomacy is needed. So it might be that these kings are actually relatively recently elected and only fleetingly hold that kind of position of power. We have things like hill forts, and certainly people have argued that these kind of defended or these enclosed settlements might represent the residences of elite or leaders. But actually, the evidence is pretty patchy, and it doesn't look like hill forts had one uniform function across Britain. Quite sometimes we find them very, very densely packed with settlement and craft working technologies. But at other times, there doesn't seem to be very much inside hill forts at all. And one of the interpretations of that these are actually communal gathering places for people, in much the same way that some of the ceremonial monuments that we see from the Neolithic, some of the henge monuments, are functioning at those times. So the jury is out on exactly what kind of society we're looking at here, and it probably varied region by region and over time, and in terms of different regions' contact with the Roman world, certainly towards the end of our period.
Can I come in and talk about sort of day-to-day life, particularly for, inverted commas, your average person, and perhaps that's harder to answer than what it was like for those who might have had greater positions of authority, as far as anybody had a greater position of authority during this point in history. It always kind of strikes me as quite a tough existence, quite a bleak life. Perhaps that's just kind of us being accustomed to the comforts of modern society. But what's life expectancy like? What sort of ailments are people suffering from? Day to day, what are they having to do? Presumably that you've got kind of basic needs to gather food in one form or another and attend to those basic needs. So talk us through it all.
Yeah, I think life would have been quite tough in the Iron Age. As for most of the rest of prehistory, most people were probably living subsistence lifestyles based on mixed farming, some craft working, to to keep themselves self-sufficient. They were living in roundhouses, which is quite an unusual settlement form actually, or house form on the continent. Everyone's living in square or rectangular buildings, as they had been doing for millennia. But in the late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, in Britain, this circular form of architecture emerges, which is really particular to the region and very interesting. We might touch on some of the reasons for that later. But they're probably living in extended families, so maybe between 20 and 50 people, depending on the size of a roundhouse, which really forces us to think about privacy and our modern attitudes to privacy, and what is considered private and what isn't. It would have been a very, very different experience, I think, in the Iron Age. They may have been living with animals at certain times inside their roundhouses. Animals probably would have needed protecting or overwintering in structures, but they also would have served to keep inhabitants nice and warm, sharing your house with your animals. And as I said, they probably would have been going about their daily lives doing mixed farming, some pottery making. We get the evidence for looms at this time, so lots of weaving of woolen cloth, which would have been a great way to express identity with the use of natural dyes. Lots of grinding of grain. We talk about the daily grind, and this comes from the need for grinding wheat on a daily basis for your bread, which you'd probably be having with some kind of vegetable stews, maybe meat on a special occasion. And some of the best evidence, I suppose, we have for daily life in terms of people's health and people's experience is through their skeletons. As we might get onto, actually, it's very difficult for us to find the remains of the dead in Iron Age Britain, but when we do, the skeleton itself gives us a lot of information. You probably would have been doing very well if you'd lived to the age of 40 in the Iron Age. We do find people living older than that, but quite a lot of people, for example, are dying at the age of kind of 25 to 35. Some people are dying in infancy. And the wear that we see on people's bones suggests that it was quite a tough life. Lots of osteoarthritis and other aspects or other clues that people are really living quite labour-intensive lives. As I said, that daily grind has a lot of impact on people's knees. We see these things called squatting facets, which show that people are kind of squatting in front of the fire or the quernstone, which is a prehistoric kind of millstone, for long periods each day. Looking at dental health, for example, there's individuals who have multiple dental abscesses when they die, and this, there's no pain relief really in this period. So, something as trivial, we might think, as toothache would have absolutely have been able to kill you in the Iron Age, if you got an abscess and septicemia or sepsis from that. And it's very likely that a lot of people did die from toothache in the Iron Age. So, yeah, quite a tough existence, I think.
It doesn't sound much fun, if I'm honest. I'm thinking of my Amazon Prime and all of my worldly comforts and thinking, no, I don't. Dead at 25 sounds quite grim. You've mentioned burials already. A lot of your work is connected with burials. So what do we know about people's beliefs about death, and how does that tie in with religion generally? Are there tells when you find a burial where you're like, I know that's Iron Age?
Yeah, well, there's a curious thing about burials actually in the Iron Age, and again, this varies between regions and over time. But there's a saying basically that in Iron Age Britain, it's not necessarily the case on the continent, where we have lots of human remains, lots of burials. But in Iron Age Britain, the dead are considered to be elusive or invisible, because we know lots and lots of people are living in the Iron Age. We have the archaeology, we have the settlement evidence to demonstrate that they are. But in death, we don't find them. It's very, very rare for us to find lots and lots of people laid out in cemeteries, for example. Towards the late Iron Age, we do get large cemeteries of people, and particularly in southeastern England, large cremation cemeteries. In the Middle Iron Age, there's a large regional tradition, the Arras culture in Yorkshire, of burying people under barrows. So these are kind of earthen mounds, and you get people being inhumed. So that's not burnt, they're just buried under these mounds. But these really are the exceptions to the rule. In most of Iron Age Britain, it's very, very hard to find people. And it's actually that negative evidence that gives us a clue to what might be happening with people. Where we do find human remains, quite often we find the odd bone of kind of select isolated bone, or sometimes quite weathered, quite bashed about, deposited in very odd places on settlement sites, which is the bulk of our archaeological evidence at this period in relation to, for example, earlier periods where we have lots of funerary evidence. In Iron Age Britain, it's mainly the settlements that we're looking at, and we find these isolated human bones turning up in strange places there. And what this suggests to us actually is that the dominant funerary treatment in the Iron Age was probably something like excarnation. An excarnation essentially is exposure burial, something similar to what you might think about if you think about Tibetan sky burial today. It's basically leaving the body somewhere, either in a protected location, but quite often in a natural location, to be gradually and naturally disarticulated and defleshed by the wind, the weather, by scavenging animals. And this is probably fulfilling exactly the same kind of function as other kinds of mortuary rite, for example, cremation, where you're doing something with the body to disarticulate it, fragment it, and allow maybe the soul or something similar to leave the physical body and to make that transition to another world. So it's not leaving people out exposed to be naturally disarticulated is not a disrespectful process or practice. It's just another way of kind of dealing with your dead and facilitating that journey from one world to the next. It seems then that maybe people are going back and interacting with those remains, picking up the odd bone as a keepsake or a memento, and going back and depositing it somewhere in their settlement. The research that I've done in Roundhouses, quite often these bones are deposited in people's houses themselves, which suggests that people had very, very close relationships with the dead actually at this time, even though we can't really find them, and that it wasn't so cut off from daily life as it might appear today. When the dead we're sort of protected from death and post-mortem care and those kinds of things. So I always say, the dead don't really rest in peace in prehistory. They have jobs to play and roles to play, and people are interacting with them, even if in an archaeological sense we can't always find them.
Can I ask about the people who do get some kind of burial? Do we have a sense of where they might have existed within the hierarchy? My sort of perception, and I suspect that this is just based on primary level
it's
Iron
time
Age
team,
history.
Jack. Just admit it. It's based on time team.
It's not even time team, mate. It's like, what did you learn at year 3 when you were also doing Egyptian mummies and stuff like that? But my sense is that you sort of have this funerary mound, if you like, and this is going to be an incorrect perception, but your chieftain gets buried in your mound, and then it's covered over, and it's those sites that then give us some kind of clues about what people like to be buried with and so on. That's probably all completely bogus. So please feel free to educate me. Do we have that kind of thing? And perhaps more interestingly, do we have any sense of what people might have been buried with, and whether or not they had that kind of sense of an afterlife and you want to take your prized possessions with you?
Yeah, it's a valid question. And again, it's something that we grapple with as archaeologists. Certainly for any period in prehistory, and probably in the historic period as well, we don't what we find in the archaeological record is definitely not everybody that was alive. It's a small percentage, between probably 1 and 10% of the people. So we do have to think on what criteria of these people being selected for burial. Certainly, some of those regional traditions give us a better sense of a good cross-section of the community. For example, that Arras culture that I was talking about in Yorkshire, and one of the famous sites, Wetwang Slack is its name, has about 400 people buried, and so that's a really nice kind of cross-section of society that we don't normally see. Certainly, there people are buried with very, very specific things, and we do get some sense of hierarchy, but also the ways in which people understood themselves and their relationship with society. There does, for example, seem to be quite strict gender categories in terms of what people are buried with, whether you're buried with a brooch, for example, or a sword, and we have a lot to unpick in terms of gender in the past and what it means and its implications for the present. But there do seem to be some very specific ideas of how you should be portrayed in death, and I think this is one of the problems that archaeologists find in interpreting the burial record, because they are highly symbolic and ritualized contexts. We're not looking at the everyday that we might be looking from settlements. We're looking at people creating identities for themselves in death. And quite often that might be conforming to much stricter ideas of what is appropriate than actually what was happening in life in terms of, for example, gender. In the Arras culture, we do get some really special burials which are very unusual, and these are chariot burials. These are people buried with dismantled chariots and all manner of accoutrements, including offerings possibly for the afterlife, so joints of meat, which actually joints of meat tend to occur in all of the graves, suggesting that people are being provisioned for the afterlife. But certainly in the chariot burials, we find horse harness fittings, mirrors, if they're kind of women, if they're female. So we don't just see men buried with chariots, and weaponry, shields. And whether or not this represents the roles of these people in life, or a sort of mortuary tableau, a kind of a theatrical performance created by the mourning individuals to say something about their society at that time, we're not quite sure. And there's this very common mantra that we say in archaeology, this very common phrase, which is the dead don't bury themselves, and it's really important to remember that. And actually, so a lot of what is going into the grave, and a lot of the performances surrounding the funeral may well be more to do with what the living have to say to other bystanders and other people attending the funeral than it does about that dead individual themselves. So a very valid question and a very tricky one to answer, actually.
If I can chuck another one at you and change tack again, how does conflict work during this period? So we talked about forts. Maiden Castle stands out as an example of an Iron Age fort. How representative is it of conflict and defence during the Iron Age in Britain?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we do have evidence for interpersonal violence throughout Britain through prehistory, even from the Neolithic period onwards. From the late Bronze Age, we start to see specialized weaponry being made in bronze, so swords, for example. Some of the implements that might have caused interpersonal violence before that, for example, stone axes, obviously are multifunctional tools. You could pretty much hit someone over the head with anything. But in the late Bronze Age, we start to see the creation of specific kind of weaponry for interpersonal violence in the guise of swords. We also see defensive armor, so shields, helmets, things like that, and that continues into the Iron Age in iron. So yes, there's certainly lots and lots of evidence of interpersonal violence in the Iron Age, and this is becoming more recognised not only through the settlement evidence and the artefacts themselves, but also looking osteologically at skeletons, so looking at sharp force and blunt force trauma. A lot of the early interpretations of hill forts was that they were sort of put up as last stands against Roman invasion, and they were places where the Romans would would corral basically Iron Age populations and employ siege tactics. We don't think that so much anymore. As I said, lots and lots of hill forts have lots of activity going on, of daily life happening inside them, suggesting that in many cases hill fort is a bit of a misnomer. But there's certainly lots of evidence of interpersonal violence between Iron Age communities. So not necessarily, external forces, but actually between communities. Maiden Castle, as you say, is a really interesting example. There is a so-called cemetery outside the East Gate that was excavated by Mortimer Wheeler, so it's known as Wheeler's War Cemetery. He was very convinced at the time that this was a massacre by the Romans of an indigenous population, and the kind of interpretations have flip-flopped ever since. This is a site that keeps being returned to in terms of thinking about interpersonal violence. Certainly, there's lots and lots of trauma on the skeletons at Maiden Castle. There's an example of someone with a ballista bolt or a spearhead lodged in their spine. So that's pretty definitive evidence, for interpersonal violence. But these people are also laid out with grave goods, which doesn't suggest they've been buried particularly in a hurry. And some people suggest that actually the interpersonal violence was not the product of the Romans, but actually interpersonal violence between indigenous communities.
Can I also, again, we're going to change tack again on you, apologies, but we're going on a whistle-stop tour for this one. Roundhouses, you talked earlier about how this was a kind of development that was quite unique to Iron Age Britain. Why a roundhouse, I guess, is one of the big questions. I'm also curious about how you identify a site like that. How do you know that what you're looking at is a roundhouse? I'm not being kind of facetious with that, because obviously once you've found your various post holes, then you can work out, okay, this was a circular dwelling. But as an archaeologist, when you're going hunting for a site like that, how do you know that you're looking at something that is a post hole, I guess is where I'm going with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. So there's loads that I could say about this actually. And as you said, the roundhouse phenomenon, it's really specific to Britain and Ireland at this time. Everywhere else on the continent, except for parts of northwest France, actually, have square or rectangular architecture at this time. And for that reason, it actually took us a very, very long time in British archaeology to recognise roundhouses, because we kept looking for square things. And the type of excavations that were taking place in the middle of the 20th century were quite small keyhole excavations, which meant that you weren't really exposing things in plan very often. And for a long time, because people couldn't find square buildings, but they did find a lot of pits, so big pits dug into the ground. For a long time, people thought that Iron Age people in Britain were living in pits with little roofs over the top, which to us today doesn't sound very likely, and indeed that was incorrect. And it was actually a German archaeologist, Gerhard Bersu, who was one of the first people to recognise roundhouses in Britain, and that was because he was using an excavation technique that they used in Germany, which was large area stripping of sites. So rather than these small keyhole trenches, he stripped large areas of topsoil. And then suddenly these round structures started appearing in plan. Identified, as you said, mostly by post holes, sometimes with circular, what we would call ring ditches or ring gullies. And the way that you identify these negative features is that they're normally infilled with much darker, more organic, rich material. And they stand out like spots against the background geology. Why we think they're roundhouses and not anything else? Well, as I alluded to, the nature of the archaeological record shifts massively in the late Bronze Age from large ceremonial monuments, lots of funerary monuments such as barrows and henges, and these kind of big ceremonial landscapes that we find in earlier prehistory. They tend to disappear or go out of use and are replaced by almost exclusively settlement evidence. As I said, the dead are elusive, apart from in very specific regions. And so we know pretty much when we've got a circular structure that that's going to be a settlement or a house rather than a funeral monument. it's an interesting question that you ask about how we identify roundhouses and how we study them, because although we can identify their outlines, quite often the floor surfaces, which would give us a clue as to what kinds of things are taking place in the roundhouse, are completely truncated by later activity. And so it's actually very, very difficult for us to reconstruct exactly the kinds of processes that are happening in roundhouses. There's lots of pits, which are good traps for material, but in terms of working out exactly in which bit of the roundhouse certain tasks are taking place, that's really difficult. And even when we do find artifacts in roundhouses, they don't necessarily reflect a sort of Pompeii. It's not the case that their distribution reflects exactly what people were doing in that roundhouse at any one time. It turns out that Iron Age people were actually very house proud, and they swept out their roundhouses often and kept them scrupulously clean. So if you find a roundhouse full of stuff, there's a slightly different explanation for that, rather than people having just upped and left and left their rubbish behind them.
And you did a big archival project on this as part of your PhD, I believe. So talk us through what you were looking for and what you found as a result of that.
Yeah, I did. And I was working on a fantastic site called Broxmouth in southeast Scotland. It's a hill fort site, but again, demonstrates the slight misnomer. It's only 25 metres above sea level, so not really on a hill at all. But it's slightly raised from the rest of the East Lothian coastal plain, which is very low lying. And it's sort of a huge continuous period of use for about 800 years, from about 600 BC to about AD 200. Now, in this part of Britain, we're still in the Iron Age at this point. The Romans moved very slowly north, and so we can consider this still to be Iron Age at this point. And I was looking particularly at the last phase of settlement at this particular site, from about 200 BC to about 200 AD. And I was talking about the difficulty of identifying roundhouses in much of, well, particularly England, but in much of Britain, because they're represented by, just these negative features, these post holes. But at Broxmouth, the roundhouses were variously built from timber and stone, and the stone walls and floors of these structures survived really, really, really well, and provided a great opportunity for me to study in detail the development of this settlement, and particularly the development of a couple of the houses themselves. And it told me such interesting things about what it meant to live in Iron Age society and be part of one of these households, because of all of the strange things that were going on in some of these houses.
Something else that you specifically look at is cave archaeology. So how does that work in terms of the telltale signs that it's a site worth exploring, and what do you actually find?
Yeah, well, caves are fantastic sites in the fact that they've always been considered, I think, and still are today by many people, to be these places outside of the domesticated world. We often talk about them being liminal places, so betwixt and between. They're neither one thing nor the other. They're not really part of the inhabited world, and they're not really fully part of another world either. There may be portals between them. And yes, I got involved in cave archaeology because I was writing up another archive of a site, this time in northeast Scotland, called the Sculptor's Cave, where there's very intriguing evidence. And this included basically an assemblage of disarticulated human bones in this particular site. As I said, the dead are elusive for much of Iron Age Britain, and so this was a fantastic opportunity to work out what people in this particular location were doing with their dead. And what they were doing is they were coming to the cave and laying out their dead, and again visiting them and interacting with them over a period of about 1,500 years.
How does what's happening in Britain differ from elsewhere in the world?
Britain is quite unique, I think, in the Iron Age in terms of the rest of the continent. As I said, I've already mentioned a couple of things. So instead of having square and rectangular architecture, we have round architecture. And I think that feeds into the fact that on the continent, there's also a good visibility of the dead. There's quite clear distinctions between the kind of funerary sphere, the sphere of the dead, and the domestic sphere. And in Britain, that all comes together at this point. The kind of ceremonial landscape and the funerary landscape disappears. and everything comes into the roundhouse. And what's really interesting is that the monuments the ceremony monuments that we see in early prehistory are all round in Britain and elsewhere. So the henges, the stone circles, the timber circles, the round barrows, they're all round. And I think the roundhouses are taking their cues from these monuments, and basically transferring that symbolic power, that symbolic sphere into the domestic, and just returning, I guess, to the roundhouses at Broxmouth. People really did seem to be investing a lot in their settlements and their houses at this time. There's one particular house at Broxmouth that's built in stone, and it's rebuilt again and again and again, 5 times in fact, on the same house stump. Instead of dismantling the walls and reusing the paving, people actually rebuild the same structure inside the shell of the old one. So they keep all that defunct fabric, that fabric from their ancestors, from the previous inhabitants around them. They're essentially living inside of the shell of this ancient building. And every time they do this, they deposit little caches of artifacts in between the walls and under the walls and under the floors and into the pits. These aren't very shiny artifacts. They're nothing that we would get particularly excited about today if we found them. Bone spoons, quern stones for grinding grain, gaming pieces, and even human remains. So there's a cranial fragment and a mandible fragment, so a fragment of the skull and a fragment of the jaw, actually deposited in one of these roundhouses at Broxmouth, just demonstrating that their whole world, their whole cosmology, the way that they understand the world around them, is really focusing down now onto the settlements and into the houses.
Lindsey, this has been an absolute education. There's so much that I've picked up from this that I was completely clueless about. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, if they head over to, if they Google me and head over to either the University of York staff pages or Canterbury Christchurch University staff pages, there's little bios about me and what I do. Because as you can see, I do a couple of different things, and a list of my publications which deal in a bit more detail with some of the things that I've touched upon today, which of course I could spend hours and hours talking to you about.
And is there a booking coming anytime soon?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there a booking coming anytime soon?
Oh, well, I'm not sure. We'll have to see. Watch this space.
Lindsey, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/history hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great